I've always believed that when someone dies, the only thing that survives is memory. But memory, I've learned, can be bent and rewritten by the living. In my family, the people I thought would steady me were the first to erase me. I pulled my late husband's old sweater tighter around my shoulders as I stepped into Attorney Whittaker's office. The fabric smelled faintly of mothballs and grief, and I clutched a paper cup of coffee as if it were an anchor. The overhead lights were too white, too sharp, bouncing off the polished table lined with stacks of documents. I slid into a chair at the far end, the cup trembling in my hand. Brianna looked at me the way you might look at a stain on silk, annoyed that it couldn't be scrubbed out. She tilted her chin, her voice carrying in the air-conditioned chill. "Don't expect anything, Mother." The word mother cracked against me like ice. Ethan, my son, sat beside her, his shoulders hunched. He stared at the hardwood floor as if he might find forgiveness in its grain. Whittaker cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Flipping open the file, each turn of the page sounded final, like a judge's gavel. "The lakeside house will be transferred to Ethan and Brianna," he read. The scrape of Brianna's chair legs against the floor was louder than it needed to be. She leaned toward Ethan, squeezing his hand like a conqueror displaying her prize. I watched the gesture and felt my stomach twist. That house, its porch facing the water, the cedar walls I stained myself, had once been promised to me. Whittaker's voice droned on. "The retirement account will be converted into an educational fund for the grandchildren." Brianna's perfume filled the room, thick and cloying. My coffee had gone cold, but I kept holding it, my knuckles bleaching white. She looked straight at me and smiled, sugar-sweet with venom underneath. "See." He thought about the future. Our future, not the past. I searched the pages for my name, each sentence falling like a stone in my chest. Whittaker paused, his lips pressing into a line. He shuffled the documents, then closed them. My name had never been spoken. It was as if 35 years of marriage had evaporated in a few strokes of ink. The silence in the room was unbearable. Only the hum of the air conditioner filled it. Steady and indifferent. Ethan did not look up. He didn't defend me, didn't say a word. I set the paper cup down, leaving a faint brown ring on the polished wood. The stain spread slowly, as though time itself were mocking me. And all I could think, the thought circling me like a hawk that refused to land, was whether he had kept the promise he once whispered to me, "You'll never be left behind." Ethan's hand tightened around Brianna's the moment Whittaker said it aloud. "The lakeside house will be transferred to Ethan." I watched the way his thumb traced the back of her hand, a nervous tick, though she received it like a coronation. Her smile flared across the table, blinding in its certainty. The room reacted before I could breathe. A ripple of applause broke out from Brianna's relatives. Claps that echoed too long in the cramped office. I lowered my eyes to the scuffed toes of my shoes, staring until the outlines blurred. They applauded as though it were a wedding toast, not a ledger entry that carved away a piece of me. That house had been my refuge. I could still smell the pine boards we sanded, the sharp scent of stain rising in waves as I brushed each plank. I remembered the ache in my shoulders the day we finished the porch, and how my husband had stood behind me, hands on my waist, whispering that the house was ours. We had painted the walls a shade too pale, so I brewed coffee stronger than usual just to make the mornings feel fuller. Every corner of that house held echoes of laughter, of slammed doors during Ethan's teenage years, of birthday candles sputtering in lake breezes. But memory isn't admissible in a lawyer's office. Only signatures are. Years ago, when Ethan was still in college, his father asked me to sign the deed so it would pass to him, one day. Clean and simple. I'd signed because I trusted a promise, his promise, that the house would always remain in the family, untouched. What I didn't realize was that family meant something smaller, meaner, once Brianna drew her lines. Whittaker's voice faded into the background as I fought to steady my breath. Brianna leaned in close to Ethan, whispering something that made his mouth twitch into a smile. I tried to imagine what she was saying. Maybe about renovations, maybe about selling it for profit. But the images hurt too much to linger on. A flash of memory intruded. Sharp as broken glass the day Ethan learned to swim in that lake. He had been 7, his skinny arms thrashing, and I had cheered from the dock until my throat was raw. That water had once baptized him into bravery. Now it baptized me into absence. The applause dwindled, leaving only the quiet shuffle of papers. No one looked my way. I was furniture, the kind that creaks when it's too old to be useful. Still, beneath the sting, a stubborn truth rose. No piece of paper could strike the image of my son dripping wet, his grin wide as the horizon. No signature could erase the memory of my husband's hand covering mine as we hammered nails into cedar. The house might belong to them now, but it was built of more than timber and ink. And memories, unlike deeds, cannot be transferred. Whittaker's voice was steady, almost clinical, when he moved to the next section. The retirement account will be converted into an educational trust for the grandchildren. The words settled over the room like dust. Ethan nodded, polite and stiff, as though approval were expected. Brianna, though, reacted with the flair of a victor. She squeezed his hand so tightly I saw his knuckles blanch, then turned her gaze on me. Her eyes lingered there, sharp, deliberate, as though to remind me what territory she had claimed. "At least this isn't wasted," she said, lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. The air between us tightened. Everyone else seemed content to let her words pass, but I felt them strike like a slap. Wasted, that was the word she used. I looked down at my lap, at the wrinkles of my sweater where my fingers dug in. If she had peeled back the silence, she would have found the truth. It was my hands that had built that account. I had shifted my own modest retirement savings into his, at his request, because he told me it would grow faster that way. I believed him. I trusted him. I thought marriage was a ledger written in shared ink, not separate columns. The memory came uninvited, me sitting at the bank desk, pen in hand, transferring balances. The banker had asked twice if I was sure. My husband had squeezed my shoulder, murmuring, "It's for the kids. For the future." I signed because I wanted to believe in a future that was ours. And here I sat, watching that same money turn into a gift that excluded me. A trust, they called it. As if the word itself weren't bitterly ironic. I could almost hear Brianna's unspoken triumphs. My sacrifice had been folded neatly into her inheritance, as if I had been only a conduit. I wondered if Ethan even remembered those afternoons when I took double shifts so that we could keep making contributions. He was a boy then, coming home to cold suppers because I was at the diner pouring coffee for strangers. The grandchildren would benefit now. That thought should have comforted me. But comfort is thin when it comes wrapped in erasure. I wanted them to thrive, of course I did. But I wanted someone, anyone, to say aloud that the foundation of that trust had been laid, brick by brick, with pieces of my life. Instead, the room stayed silent, and Brianna's perfume curled closer, thick and cloying. Ethan's eyes never met mine. Sacrifice, I realized, doesn't echo in rooms like this. It disappears into signatures and legal language, faceless and forgotten. When the papers closed with a soft thud, I thought, when families divide an inheritance, no one remembers who gave up what to make it possible. Whittaker's voice faltered just long enough for me to notice. He adjusted his glasses, shuffled the documents into a neat stack, then cleared his throat. "There is," he said slowly. "Final section." The room shifted. Chairs creaked, breaths caught. Brianna's manicured hand froze on Ethan's wrist. "A final section," she repeated, her voice sharp enough to slice the air. She turned to my son, her expression cracking for the first time that afternoon. "What else did your father hide from us?" Her words stung, the ways excluded me without hesitation. I stayed still, my palms pressed against my thighs to keep them from shaking. Whittaker bent down to retrieve something from his briefcase. When he rose, he held a slim envelope, the flap sealed with an old-fashioned wax stamp. Its edges were yellowed, softened with time. As he set it on the table, the envelope slipped from his hand and landed near my coffee cup, catching a faint brown smear across one corner. My breath snagged. That stain, an echo of countless mornings when my husband had scolded me gently for spilling coffee onto bills, onto letters, onto life itself. Brianna leaned forward, her voice pitched higher now. "This isn't in the copy we received. Why wasn't it disclosed?" Whittaker raised a calming hand. "It was delivered separately, to be opened only after the primary sections were read." His tone was professional, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Recognition, maybe even unease. The wax glistened in the fluorescent light, deep red against pale paper. A promise, sealed long before this moment. I wondered when he'd written it. The last hospital stay. A sleepless night by the lake. I wanted to believe it was meant for me, some sliver of recognition, but hope is dangerous in rooms like these. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his knee bouncing under the table. For a second, his gaze flicked to me. Just a second, but it was there. Then Brianna tugged his hand back, anchoring him. I remembered our kitchen table years ago, covered with tax forms and grocery lists. He had pressed my hand to the page once, grinnings. Every promise I make, I keep, even if it takes years. The memory washed over me, too vivid to ignore, and I felt my throat tighten. Now, staring at the sealed envelope, I thought of that vow. Maybe promises had a way of circling back, no matter how carefully others tried to bury them. Whittaker rested his hand on the envelope, not yet breaking the seal. "We'll proceed with this once everyone is ready," he said. No one in the room was ready, least of all me. Still, as the brown stain bled slowly across the edge of the paper, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe all afternoon. Promises may be delayed, bent, even mocked, but they never disappear. They find their way back, stubborn as memory, relentless as love. The dining room was too bright, the chandelier light bouncing off crystal glasses and polished silverware, until it felt like I was sitting in a spotlight. Yet somehow, at the far end of the table, I was invisible. I folded my hands in my lap, listening to the clatter of forks, the chatter of Brianna's family filling the air. No one turned to me. No one asked about my day, or if I wanted more bread. I might as well have been a ghost, haunting my own family dinner. I stared down the long stretch of linen tablecloth, watching Ethan through the blur of wine glasses. He looked tired, older than his years, but when Brianna leaned close, he dutifully nodded at her every word. I wondered if he realized how much he resembled his father when he did that. Chin tilted just so, the way his eyes dropped when he didn't want to fight. I took a spoonful of soup, its steam clouding my glasses. I wished for silence, for once, but instead Brianna's voice rose above the clinking plates. "There are people," she announced, her words deliberate, aimed down the table like darts, "who just don't know when to be ashamed." A ripple of laughter from her side of the family followed, thin and brittle. My spoon clattered against the bowl. She didn't need to say my name. The room knew where her eyes were fixed. I kept my gaze on my soup, watching the surface quiver. I wanted Ethan to say something, anything. A defense, a distraction, even just a cough to cut the tension. But he only stared at his bowl, circling his spoon slowly, as though the broth held secrets worth studying. His silence filled the space louder than her insult ever could. For a moment, I remembered the boy he once was, sitting at a different table in that lakeside house. He'd bang his fists against the table, demanding more mashed potatoes, his laughter spilling over like water. Back then, his voice had been unstoppable, bright, a sound that filled the rooms I worked so hard to keep warm. Now, in this polished dining room, that voice was gone. All I heard was the steady scrape of utensils, Brianna's satisfied smirk, and the hollow in my chest expanding wider with every second. I thought about speaking, about rising to meet her cruelty head-on, but my throat felt sewn shut. Words can defend, but sometimes they betray too, when no one wants to hear them. I lowered my eyes instead, tracing the stitching on the napkin, pretending it was enough to occupy me. Silence has its own weight, heavier than any insult. As I sat there, I realized that sometimes the absence of a son's voice cuts deeper than the presence of a daughter, in-law's venom. And in that moment, I understood. It isn't the shouting that wounds most. It's the quiet, complicit silence that lingers long after the plates are cleared. I smoothed the edges of the envelope until the paper grew soft beneath my fingertips. Inside was a check, modest compared to the figures Brianna bragged about, but it carried something weightier than money. My handwriting wobbled where I had signed my name, the ink bleeding slightly into the fibers. Age had made my hand less steady, but the signature was still mine, proof that I wanted to give something of myself, something that might outlast the hostility, thickening the air between us. I placed it gently in front of Brianna at the reception, sliding it across the linen tablecloth like a peace offering. The band played something cheerful in the background, but in my chest, the rhythm was offbeat. She looked down at the envelope as if it were contaminated. Then, with a practiced smile stretched too tight, she pushed it back toward me. "We don't need old money," she said, loud enough for the people around us to hear. "We don't need charity from the past." The words sliced cleanly, efficient as a scalpel. My throat burned. For a moment I thought I might plead with her, tell her the money had come from nights I skipped dinners so Ethan could have new cleats, from early mornings where I walked to work instead of paying for gas. but her expression left no room for explanation. She wanted the rejection to be public, to make sure everyone understood her place in mine. I curled my fingers around the envelope, the paper suddenly heavy, like it contained not dollars but years of sacrifice. The laughter from nearby tables rose in waves, covering the sound of my heart cracking open. It was Ethan who shifted first. He reached across the table, his eyes flickering toward mine only briefly. When Brianna turned her head to greet a cousin, he slipped the envelope from my hand and tucked it discreetly into the pocket of his suit jacket. His movement was swift, practiced, the way a boy might sneak candy when no one was watching. He didn't say a word, just a quiet squeeze of his pocket, as if assuring me it was safe there. I should have felt relief, but what washed over me instead was something more complicated. Gratitude wrapped in sorrow. My son hadn't defended me aloud, hadn't challenged his wife's disdain, but in that small act of theft, he acknowledged me, if only in secret. I sat back, folded my hands in my lap, and let the music wash over me. Around us, the celebration swelled, champagne glasses clinking, shoes tapping on the dance floor. And yet, at that table, something silent and fragile passed between us, carried not by words but by the crumpled weight of an envelope. Not every gift is received in the open. Some are meant to be hidden, carried close to the heart, away from the eyes of those who would sneer. And sometimes, the truest offering is the one accepted in shadows, when no one else is watching. The reception hall buzzed with laughter and music, a sea of sequin dresses and polished shoes twirling beneath chandeliers. I lingered near the edge of it all, my back pressed lightly against the wall, clutching a glass of water I hadn't touched. I had grown used to the background, to being placed near bathrooms or tucked into corners, out of the camera's frame. That was when a man broke from the circle of guests and walked toward me. His shoulders carried the kind of weight that comes from decades of responsibility, but his steps were deliberate, unhurried. He extended his hand. "You're the groom's mother, aren't you?" His voice was warm, surprising in its gentleness. I hesitated before shaking his hand. "Yes," I managed, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. "I'm Richard," he said, "Brianna's father." My grip faltered. For a second, I braced for the same polished disdain his daughter wore so effortlessly. But Richard's eyes searched mine, curious rather than condemning. "Forgive me," he continued, lowering his voice just enough so it wouldn't carry. "But you look different than how Brianna described you." The words landed with a strange mix of balm and sting. Different. I wanted to ask how, but part of me was afraid to know. "She said you were bitter, difficult," he added, frowning as though the pieces didn't match. "But you don't seem like that." Heat rushed to my cheeks. For years I had endured Brianna's redefinitions of me. An embarrassment, an obstacle, a relic best hidden in shadows. To hear her father question that story felt almost dangerous, like sunlight cracking into a locked room. I opened my mouth to respond, but he leaned in, lowering his head so that only I could hear. "If I'm being honest," he murmured, "I think you deserve a better seat than the one they gave you. Maybe even next to me, instead of being tucked away in the corner." I blinked, startled. My throat tightened around a laugh that wasn't quite joy, wasn't quite disbelief. For a moment, the din of music and chatter faded. His words, casual, almost conspiratorial, felt like a lifeline tossed across a chasm I'd been made to stand in alone. I studied his face, searching for sarcasm, but found none. Only a quiet recognition, as though he'd glimpsed the dissonance between who I was and who I'd been painted to be. Around us, glasses clinked, and someone called for a toast. But I stayed rooted, still feeling the warmth of his hand in mine. Still hearing the words he hadn't needed to say aloud. Stories have two sides, and sometimes the version repeated the loudest isn't the truest one. I smiled faintly, not out of triumph but relief. Because in that instant, I realized that even in rooms crowded with judgment, there might be one voice willing to question the script, and maybe that was enough. Because truth, I remembered, rarely exists in only one version. The envelope from the DMV sat on the kitchen table, thin and official, the kind of paper that always carried more weight than it appeared to. Brianna slid it across to me while she stirred her coffee, her nails tapping against the ceramic mug in rhythm. "It'll save us money on insurance if it's under your name, just for now," she said casually, as though she were asking me to pass the salt. "Nothing complicated. Just sign where it says owner." Ethan stood behind her silent, his shoulders slumped in that way I recognized too well. His quiet surrender that usually meant he'd already agreed. I turned the papers over in my hands, reading the printed lines, though the legal words blurred together. My name would appear where owner was written in bold. Beneath it, the section for buyer was left blank. Brianna's tone was syrupy sweet when she added, "It's just a formality, really. You'll be helping us." Helping. That word again. Helping meant handing over pieces of myself until there was nothing left. Still, I picked up the pen. My fingers trembled slightly as I signed, ink sinking into the page. My signature looked foreign, stretched thin and unsteady. When I set the pen down, Brianna plucked the papers back quickly, folding them with a crisp snap. "Perfect," she said. "You've made things so much simpler." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Later, when the phone rang and it was the insurance company, I overheard just enough to make my chest tighten. Words like salvage title and rebuilt filtered through, technical language weighted with implication. The car wasn't new. It wasn't even safe. Not in the way they'd implied when they parked it in the driveway with ribbons on the antenna. It had been salvaged, hauled from some roadside dealer who likely scrubbed away its past with paint and polish. And now, on paper, it belonged to me. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same spot where I'd signed, and pressed my hands against the wood as if I could erase the ink by sheer will. My mind went back to every form I had ever signed in my life: birth certificates, school permission slips, the mortgage on the lakeside house. My name had always meant protection, responsibility, love. Now it meant liability. I pictured the car crumpled on some highway shoulder, imagined Brianna's sharp voice insisting it wasn't her fault. Imagined Ethan's silence sealing my blame. The dealer, the accident, the salvage, all hidden behind that single word owner. I wanted to believe they hadn't meant harm, that it was just carelessness, not cruelty. But intentions mattered little when signatures turned into evidence. I pressed my fingertips to the spot where my name had sprawled across the page. It was permanent now, etched into law, unyielding. And for the first time in years, I felt the full weight of a truth I'd ignored too long. A signature, once given, is no longer a promise. It's a weapon, waiting to be used. The diner was nearly empty when I slid into the corner booth, the kind with vinyl seats that stuck to the back of your legs. The smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee clung to the air, and the jukebox in the corner played a song no one was listening to. I liked it here. Anonymous, unremarkable. The kind of place where silence didn't feel like a punishment. I ordered only a cup of coffee, though the waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a pencil tucked behind her ear, suggested pie. "Maybe later," I told her, forcing a smile. From the booth behind me, voices carried, hush but sharp enough to pierce. "Did you hear?" one woman said. She was stripped of everything. By her own son. My chest tightened. I stared into the dark swirl of coffee in my cup, wishing the vinyl cushions could swallow me whole. "That's the cruelest part." Another voice chimed in. Not some stranger, her family. The words landed like blows, each syllable prying at wounds I had tried to stitch closed. They didn't say my name, but they didn't need to. In small towns, people didn't need names for stories to stick. I pressed my hands around the mug, the heat seeping into my palms. My reflection wavered in the surface of the coffee, blurred, distorted, as though I were dissolving into someone else's version of me. Then came the harshest cut. Imagine raising a child, only to have him erase you when it mattered most. I set the cup down before my hands betrayed their shaking. The waitress returned with the check, sliding it onto the table with quiet grace. I reached for it automatically, my eyes catching on the edge of the slip. There, scrawled in looping blue ink, were 2 words: "Stay strong." The handwriting was hurried but deliberate. My throat constricted, and for a moment I couldn't speak. When I looked up, she was already walking away, tray balanced in one hand, pretending nothing had happened. I stared at the note, tracing the letters with my eyes until they blurred. It was such a small thing, nearly weightless compared to the stacks of documents that had stolen my name and my place. Yet it felt heavier than all of them combined. Because here was a stranger, someone who had no obligation to me, offering recognition. Not pity, not judgment, but a simple acknowledgement that I had been wronged, and that I wasn't invisible. I folded the slip of paper into my wallet, tucking it between old receipts and photographs, a secret talisman I could carry when the silence at home grew unbearable. Walking out of the diner, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit sometimes. It is the eyes of strangers that see you most clearly. And sometimes, the kindness of the unseen is worth more than the loyalty of the ones you thought you could trust. The folder in my hands was worn at the edges, its cardboard corners soft from years of use. I held it against my chest as I walked through the courthouse doors, each step echoing down the marble hallway. My shoes squeaked faintly, too loud for my liking, but I didn't slow down. Inside the courtroom, the air was cool and still, heavy with the weight of 100 arguments settled before this one. I chose a seat near the front, the brown folder balanced on my lap, its weight out of proportion to the few papers inside. Across the aisle, Brianna stood tall, her navy suit immaculate, her hair twisted into a severe knot. She looked like she belonged here, confident, certain, rehearsed. Ethan trailed behind her, his eyes avoiding mine, as if acknowledging me would jeopardize his place at her side. The clerk called the case, and Brianna strode forward, sliding a sheaf of documents across the polished wood to the judge. Proof of ownership, she declared, her voice steady, rehearsed, laced with the same disdain she used in family dinners. The judge leafed through the papers, nodding. My lawyer leaned closer, whispering, "Let her speak first." His tone was calm, but I could feel the thrum of urgency beneath it. I nodded, though my throat had tightened around the lump of silence I carried, as Brianna outlined her claim. Property deeds, signatures, insurance filings. I studied her face. She delivered each fact like ammunition, each pause intentional, as though rehearsed in the mirror the night before. Around us, the courtroom hummed with the scratch of pens, the shuffle of papers, the faint tap of the judge's gavel against the desk. When she finished, she straightened, satisfied, her eyes flicking toward me briefly, daring me to counter her certainty. My lawyer opened the brown folder, sliding one of my documents forward, but his hand hesitated. He leaned in so close I could feel the warmth of his breath against my ear. "There's something you need to know," he whispered. "The final section hasn't been opened yet." The words shivered through me, colder than the air-conditioned room. I clutched the folder tighter, hearing my heartbeat in the silence that followed. I looked up at Brianna, whose confidence had already begun to soften into curiosity at the whisper she could not hear. She adjusted her blazer, tilting her head as though to steady herself. Ethan shifted beside her, his gaze darting briefly to me before lowering again, as if afraid of what he might find in my face. The judge cleared his throat, signaling for us to proceed. My lawyer gave me a small nod, reassurance tucked into the movement. I inhaled slowly, the scent of paper and varnished wood filling my lungs. The final section. It was still out there, sealed, waiting. And as I rose to my feet, folder pressed against my chest, I realized something. Justice doesn't always arrive when you want it. It stumbles, it stalls, it hides in shadows. But it doesn't vanish. Sometimes it simply waits, sealed, patient, until the moment it can no longer be ignored. The attic smelled of dust and mothballs, the kind of air that clung to your skin, no matter how long you stayed. I had climbed the narrow steps slowly, each creak of the wood reminding me of how long it had been since I last came here. The single bulb swayed faintly overhead, casting shadows across boxes stacked like tombstones. It was in the far corner, half hidden beneath a moth-eaten quilt, that I found it, a small wooden box, darkened with age. The brass lock on the front was tarnished, the kind you could break with little effort, but one that still insisted on guarding its secrets. I carried it down to the kitchen, setting it on the table where the afternoon light spilled across the surface. My hands shook as I worked at the lock with a hairpin, the sound of metal scraping against metal, like a clock ticking down. When it finally gave, the lid opened with a sigh, as though it had been holding its breath all these years. Inside were papers folded neatly, brittle at the edges, their ink faded but legible. At the top of the stack lay an envelope, my name written in his handwriting, my husband's. I ran my fingers across the letters, the familiar loops and curves, and for a moment I was 25 again. Seeing my name written on the first note he'd left tucked in my locker at work. I opened it carefully, afraid the paper would tear. The letter inside was short, unfinished. The ink blotched as if he'd set the pen down mid-thought. "If you're reading this, I wasn't brave enough to tell you while I was alive. But I want you to know I see what's happening. I see how Brianna looks at you, how she speaks to you. I worry what she'll do when I'm gone. My hope is that the law will shield you. But if it doesn't, remember, this house, this life was meant to protect you, not hurt you. I pressed the paper to my chest, as if I could feel his heartbeat through the faded ink. Tears blurred the words, but I didn't need to see them anymore. I had memorized them in a single reading. He had known. He had seen the small humiliations, the sidelong glances, the dismissive tones I tried to shrug off. He had recognized the danger Brianna posed not just to our marriage, but to the dignity I carried like a fragile relic. And yet, he had said nothing aloud, had left the truth sealed in a box for me to discover only after his absence. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the letter until the light shifted and shadows stretched across the floor. There are truths, I realized, that people cannot bear to speak when they're alive. Sometimes love writes its confessions in silence, leaving them to be opened only when death loosens the tongue. Some truths arrive too late to change the past, but just in time to rewrite the present. It happened quickly, almost casually, as though destruction were just another form of decoration to her. Brianna stood in my living room, heels sinking into the old rug, her eyes sweeping over the walls like a surveyor. Her gaze settled on the framed photograph above the mantel. My wedding picture. The corners were yellowed with time, the glass cracked faintly in one place, but it had survived decades. Outdated, she muttered, her lips curling into a half-smile. Then, without asking, without hesitation, she lifted the frame and snapped it in two. The sound was sharp, a dry crack of glass and wood, as if she'd split bone. I felt it in my chest, that tearing, as though she'd reached inside and ripped through the years I still clung to. Pieces of the frame scattered to the floor, shards catching the afternoon light. She dropped half the photograph on the coffee table and brushed her hands together. "Better," she said, her tone dismissive. "Some things don't belong anymore." I bent down, hands trembling, gathering what fragments I could. Among the wreckage, a scrap of paper caught my eye. It was small. Torn from the edge of the photo, the ink faint but visible, the word forever, written in his hand. I clutched it, pressing the word against my palm, as though it might dissolve if I let go. Forever. It was the promise etched into every smile that day, the one I believed long after rings dulled and shoulders stoop. To see it torn, to hold only a fragment, felt like mourning all over again. But as I turned the piece over, something else appeared, writing sharper, less sentimental. I squinted, heart pounding. It wasn't part of the photograph at all, but another sheet that had been tucked behind it, hidden for years. It was a transfer document, folded and trimmed to fit neatly behind the frame. The ink was faded but clear, his signature, notarized, naming me as sole beneficiary of the lakeside property. My breath caught, the room tilting as though the ground beneath me had shifted. He had prepared for this. Long before lawyers, long before Brianna sharpened her claws, he had tucked away a safeguard in the only place he thought no one would touch, behind a photograph of a promise. Brianna, distracted with her phone, didn't notice the slip of paper in my hands. She didn't see the way I slid it into my pocket, fingers wrapping around it, as though it were the last lifeline left to me. For days I had felt erased, reduced to silence, but here in my palm was proof, fragile, secret, and devastating, that the story was not finished. A single scrap of paper, overlooked, almost discarded, had the power to tilt the balance of everything. And I knew, as I sat there with forever bleeding into one side and legality stamped on the other, that sometimes the smallest fragment can append the story you thought was already written. The phone rang just past midnight, its sharp chime startling in the quiet of my kitchen. I had been sitting there in the dark, the torn photograph still on the table beside me, the hidden transfer document folded neatly into the pocket of my sweater. I almost didn't answer. Calls that came after midnight were rarely kind. But when I picked up, the voice on the other end made my breath catch. "Mom." Ethan's voice was low, unsteady, as if he were whispering into a borrowed line. He broke off, the words tangling. I didn't know. I didn't know they treated you like that." I closed my eyes, pressing the receiver to my ear. For a moment, I said nothing, afraid that if I spoke, I might shatter the fragile thread connecting us. His voice, my son's voice, sounded younger in that moment, stripped of Brianna's polish, closer to the boy who once called out for me after nightmares. "They talk about you," he said, each word dragging. "Like you're less." I should have stopped it. I should have said something. My throat ached. I wanted to tell him that silence wounds as much as words, that his quiet had been louder than Brianna's barbs. But what came out instead was softer. You're here now. That's what matters. In the background, muffled but unmistakable, came Brianna's voice. Sharp, furious, tearing through the night. Hang up! Now! The line crackled with the sound of struggle, a scuffle of movement, the echo of a door closing somewhere far away. Ethan's breath quickened. I can't talk long, he whispered urgently, but I need you to know, I don't hate you. I never did. His words tumbled over themselves, as if he feared they'd be cut short. I see it now, Mom. I see everything she's done. His voice faltered. I don't know how to undo it. My chest tightened, the ache so sharp it felt like it might split me open. I wanted to reach through the line, to touch his face the way I had when he was a boy, to remind him that no mistake, no silence, no betrayal could make him anything less than my son. Before I could answer, Brianna's voice pierced again, closer this time, venom spilling. Give me that phone! The line crackled, a muffled thud, then silence. I sat in the darkness long after the call ended, the dial tone humming like a flat line. For the first time in weeks, tears slid down my cheeks, not from anger, but from something else, recognition. That even across distance, across silence, across the walls Brianna built, there was still a thread between us. Thin, frayed, but unbroken. Mother and son. No matter how far she tried to push me out, that bond was not hers to sever. The courtroom was colder that morning, or maybe it was just me. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the wooden bench, the brown folder once again resting across my lap. The judge's robe swept as he leaned forward, his voice steady as he read from the stack of documents before him. Each word sounded final, like the clang of a cell door shutting. I kept my eyes low, tracing the grain of the wood under my fingers, until I heard Brianna's heels clicking against the floor as she approached the stand. Her confidence radiated like heat. She passed another packet of documents to the clerk, her voice clear, rehearsed, dripping with certainty. Your Honor, as you can see, we hold proof of ownership. The deeds, the transfers, the signed forms, they are all here. My chest tightened. Her words stacked against me like bricks, building a wall higher and higher until I could hardly breathe. Ethan stood beside her, his face pale, his gaze cast downward. He didn't add to her words, but he didn't counter them either. His silence pressed heavier than her certainty. When the judge nodded, it felt like the gavel was already poised to fall. My lawyer rose slowly beside me, adjusting his tie with deliberate calm. He glanced at me before stepping forward, carrying not just the brown folder but something else. A slim, wax-sealed envelope, edges worn, the stain of coffee still faint in one corner. Your Honor, he said, his voice cutting through the stale air, before any ruling is made. We must acknowledge the existence of a final section of the will, delivered under strict instruction to be opened only at this stage. The courtroom murmured, whispers swelling like a sudden wind. Brianna stiffened, her head snapping toward Ethan, then back to the judge. What final section? She demanded, her voice sharp, too loud in the solemn space. The judge raised a hand, silencing her. His eyes fell on the envelope as my lawyer broke the wax seal with deliberate care. The sound was small, a soft crack, but it rang like thunder in my ears. He unfolded the paper inside and began to read aloud. In the event that my wife is ever insulted or publicly humiliated by members of this family, I hereby direct that the entirety of my estate, without exception, remain in her possession. For a moment, time stopped. The words hovered in the air, impossible and undeniable. My breath caught, a sob pressing at the back of my throat. Across the aisle, Brianna's face drained of color, her lips parting in disbelief. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes wide, as though hearing his father's voice echoing through the courtroom. The judge leaned back, nodding once, the weight of the decision now shifted entirely. Then the court recognizes the final section as binding. I closed my eyes, the words folding around me like a blanket I hadn't realized I still needed. It was as though he had reached across death itself to shield me, his promise blooming back to life in this sterile, echoing chamber. For the first time in years, I felt protected. The kitchen was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft scrape of a match against the box. I cupped my hand around the flame as it flickered to life, then lowered it to the candle stub I kept beside my husband's photograph. The glass frame was chipped at the corner, but his smile shone through as clearly as it had on the day it was taken. The candlelight softened the edges of the photo, casting his face in a golden glow that blurred the years between then and now. I sat down slowly, folding my hands in front of me. The courtroom's words still echoed in my chest, each syllable heavy with meaning. "You kept your promise," I whispered, the words trembling as they left me. Even from the other side, tears slipped down my cheeks before I could stop them. I let them fall, let them carve hot paths across skin grown thin with age. For so long, I had felt erased. By lawyers, by signatures, by Brianna's disdain. And yet, here in the quiet of my kitchen, his voice had risen again, not in sound but in action, through the will that bore his mark. The candle flame wavered as though in answer, and I let out a shaky breath. "You saw me, even when no one else did. You saw me. Behind me." The floor creaked softly. I turned, startled, wiping at my eyes with the back of my hand. Ethan stood in the doorway, his face caught between shadow and light. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. His hands shook at his sides, his expression raw, stripped of the confidence Brianna always demanded from him. Without a word, he bent down beside me, lowering himself until his knees touched the worn linoleum floor. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't understand. Not until now." His head bowed, and in that posture, kneeling there, eyes closed, his breath shuddering, I saw not the man Brianna had molded, but the boy who once knelt beside me to tie his shoelaces before school. My tears came harder, not from sorrow this time, but from the fragile hope flickering between us. I reached out, my hand hovering for a moment before settling gently on his shoulder. The gesture was tentative, uncertain, but he leaned into it, as though he had been waiting years for that touch. We stayed like that in silence, the candle burning low, the room heavy with both grief and something close to forgiveness. I knew then what I had almost forgotten: not everyone forgets. Some just take longer to remember. And sometimes, when they finally do, it is enough. The conference room had emptied, leaving only the buzz of the neon sign outside the window bleeding pink and blue across the polished surface of the table. The files lay stacked neatly now, the wax seal broken, the words read aloud. Justice, in its dry legal language, had spoken. But the silence between Brianna and me was louder than any verdict. She sat opposite me, her back straight, her jaw tight, her manicured nails drumming against the tabletop. The victory she had been so sure of had dissolved into something brittle. Still, her eyes were sharp, daring me to flinch, daring me to accept less than what was mine. For the first time in a long time, I didn't shrink back. I leaned forward slightly, the neon light catching the lines on my face. My voice came out steady, surprising even me. "From this moment on," I said, each word deliberate, "you have no right to call me mother." The title tasted bitter in my mouth. She had wielded it like a weapon for years, stripping it of affection and filling it with contempt. Saying it aloud, denying her its use, was like cutting a chain from my chest. Her mouth opened as if to retort, but no words came. She blinked once, twice, then leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. Her silence was not victory, it was retreat. The neon hummed, my heart pounded. For once, I felt the room tilt in my favor. Then I felt it, a warm pressure against the back of my hand. I turned, startled, to find Ethan beside me. He had moved without my noticing, sliding into the chair at my side. His hand covered mine, firm, steady. "You have me," he whispered, his voice breaking, almost too soft to hear. "And that's enough?" The air shifted. My throat closed, my eyes burning, as though his words had cracked something open in me that had long been sealed shut. I had spent months, years, perhaps, believing I had lost him entirely. Yet here he was, not with grand gestures or courtroom speeches, but with something far smaller, far truer to hand, a whisper, a promise. Brianna looked at him, her face blanching as if she no longer recognized the man she had thought she controlled. He didn't meet her gaze. His eyes stayed on mine. In that moment, I realized something I should have known all along: boundaries are not the end of love. They are the soil where respect can grow. By drawing the line with her, I wasn't closing a door, I was opening one, for myself, for Ethan, for whatever would come next. The files on the table no longer felt heavy. The neon glow seemed warmer, less harsh. This wasn't an ending, I thought, as Ethan's hand tightened gently around mine. It was a beginning. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. This story wasn't just about inheritance or paper signatures. It was about dignity, sacrifice, and the boundaries we sometimes must draw to protect ourselves. Too often, love is taken for granted until it's nearly erased, and respect only appears when we demand it. If this story touched you, let it remind you that even in the face of betrayal, strength and self-respect can still be reclaimed. And sometimes, healing begins the moment we stop waiting for others to define our worth. This is Telling Story with me. If you felt moved by this story, please share it with someone who might need the reminder. Leave a comment with your thoughts. And don't forget to like and subscribe to join me for more stories that cut to the heart of family, love, and resilience.